Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Iran continues to play hardball as Israeli and American officials discuss alternatives to the JCPOA nuclear deal. Meantime, it turns out that Hamas, the internationally recognized Palestinian terror group, may not be radical enough. ISIS-like organizations now appearing to gain a foothold in the Hamas-run Gaza Strip. And finally, amidst a series of heat waves burning their way through the region, the United Nations releasing a damning report on the scale of global climate change. But Israel is hoping to be a beacon in the efforts to turn back the clock. To begin, an attack overnight Monday to Tuesday reported near the Yitzhak junction of the northern West Bank. A Palestinian woman attempting to stab IDF soldiers near the junction before being shot in the leg and subdued. According to the Israeli army, the suspected female terrorist, looking noticeably suspicious from the onset, sitting beside the side of the road before soldiers approached her. And upon the approach, the suspect reportedly revealing her knife and beginning to charge towards the troops. The IDF, for its part, however, opening fire towards her feet, lightly wounding her before her arrest. Army officials confirming that there are no IDF casualties or injuries and that the yet unidentified suspect has been taken to hospital for her wounds. Israel, in the aftermath of the recent conflict in May between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, similar attacks becoming a nearly daily occurrence, though since then the frequency largely subsiding. Moving on, internationally recognized terror group Hamas, often largely blamed for ongoing incitement and terror, but recent events in the Hamas-run Gaza Strip are showing that perhaps they're no longer extreme enough. The Bianco Resort, one of the most luxurious seaside sites in the Strip, was bombed last Thursday, and an ISIS-inspired group is taking the credit, explaining that they attacked after both Hamas and the resort ignored calls to cancel a mixed-gender concert. Now, thankfully, there were no injuries reported, but the attack and its perpetrators are seemingly gaining influence, much to the chagrin of Hamas and other Palestinian factions in the Strip. So what does this mean for Gaza, the Palestinians, and for the region? Joining me to discuss, senior analyst at the Abba Eban Institute of IDC Herzliya, Reserves Major Danny Citrinowicz. Major, thank you so much for being with us. Now, how serious of a threat are groups like this to Hamas in Gaza? And for that matter, what about in the Palestinian Authority?
I think that the threat is still minor. This is because of the fact that Hamas still has a strong grip in Gaza Strip. It uses its security capabilities and, of course, intelligence capabilities in order to make sure that they really oversee these groups, leaders, mosques, and, of course, the connection between ISIS infrastructure in Gaza and ISIS infrastructure in Egypt. Now, I think I'm not undermining this event, but I think that for now the threat is minor. But one other thing that I want to emphasize is the fact that this event really highlights the importance of strong governance in Gaza Strip. Now, I know Hamas is a terrorist organization, but for now it's the lesser of two evils. We can work with Hamas, customs interaction with, we're putting some pressure on it through the Egyptians. So between the choice of ISIS and Hamas, for now, we're better off working in a way with Hamas, making sure that there is still governance in the Gaza Strip, and groups like ISIS are being taken care of by Hamas.
So what can Hamas effectively do about this threat?
I think that Hamas is really acting, making sure that we won't see any other event like the Bianca event. I think that they're working hard, making sure that things are happening they're making sure that they know or they're overseeing anything that's happening in the mosques that ISIS is working within. They are using a lot of intelligence capabilities, making sure that they are oversee the connection between ISIS in Egypt and ISIS in Gaza. So they won't see some sort of radicalization on this group. And I think they really want to contain this group, making sure that there'll be isolated events and Hamas will still have the upper end. Of course, not only operationally, but also ideologically. For Hamas, it's extremely important that this group will not have any sort of grip within Gaza Strip.
Now, is this issue a bet of Hamas's own making? That is to say that, for example, that Hamas has gained popularity against Fatah for being stronger in fighting Israel and for their Islamic ideologies, etc. But Hamas is also careful, as you said, not to push too far. They're the lesser of two evils. So is it possible that Hamas actually preached extremism beyond what they could deliver and thereby drove supporters right into ISIS's arms?
That's a great question. Actually, if you remember, when the Palestinian Authority controlled Gaza, we saw Hamas really doing the same thing, just harassing them and saying that they're not following the true ideology. But I think in the case of Hamas, this is not the thing. Hamas is looking really to the far future, to the long-term future. For them, it's not a problem to making some sort of tactical compromises, even working in some way with Israel, making sure that they're fulfilling their own true interests. But nothing has changed regarding Hamas ideology. For the long run, they are calling and want achieving the destruction of the state of Israel. So these events are important, and I think that for Israel and Hamas, we have the same interest. But for the long term, for sure, Hamas hasn't changed its ideology.
All right, so back again now to Israel and Egypt. Can and are they doing anything? Should they do something? How could they get involved? Again, because Hamas is the lesser of two evils, in order to ensure that ISIS doesn't take over.
So for that, I think there are a lot of tension between Hamas and Egypt, especially because of the fact, as you know, Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood that posing a real threat to Sisi's government. But regarding ISIS, there are mutual interests. Both sides want to work together in order to weaken ISIS presence in Egypt, in Sinai Peninsula, and of course in Gaza Strip. So I think that this kind of cooperation, operational one, but also intelligence one between Hamas and Egypt can come to play. So I think that two sides are working together in order to work against ISIS presence in their own domain. So I think it's important. It also regarding Israel, I think this kind of cooperation between Hamas and Egypt is important because it allows Egypt to put a lot of pressure on Hamas when it relates to Israel interest. So in that sense, I think Egypt and Hamas working together, that's not a bad sign regarding Israel interest in Gaza.
All right, Major Dan Citrinowicz, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Now, as tensions between Iran and Israel rising, CIA Director William Joseph Burns landing in Tel Aviv for a 3-day visit. The trip including meetings with various Israeli political and military officials and reportedly in efforts of fine-tuning coordinations between Jerusalem and D.C., particularly regarding the possible renewal of the 2015 JCPOA nuclear agreement. CIA Director Bill Burns arriving in Israel on Tuesday and scheduled to meet with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett as well as various other defense and intelligence officials. Iran is at the top of Burns' agenda. Both Israel and the West particularly disturbed by recent Iranian attacks on international shipping routes, as well as Tehran's continued progress towards developing nuclear weapons, while JCPOA talks in Vienna stall.
הלא איראן הפילה מטוס אזרחי ותקפה ספינה אזרחית, תוך הרג אזרחים ממגוון מדינות ברחבי העולם. המשטר האיראני מפעיל טרור על נתיבי התחבורה הבינלאומיים. איראן מהווה סכנה ברורה ליציבות האזור, לשלום העולם, ואסור שהעולם ישלים עם זה.
Likewise, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken renewing promises to hold Iran to account, accusing Tehran of a recent and ongoing pattern of attacks and other provocative behavior, adding that the world cannot allow impunity. Iran, meantime, delaying the resumption of nuclear talks, while enriching uranium far beyond both the limits set in the JCPOA as well as what's necessary for civilian use. And Israeli authorities even claiming that Iran is less than 3 months away from a nuclear bomb, which, if true, confirms U.S. and European concerns that Iran's advancements have rendered re-signing the JCPOA an irrelevant act to begin with. Iran, for its part, however, throwing blame back on the West. Newly inaugurated Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, a.k.a. the hangman of Tehran, speaking to French President Macron in his first official phone call to a Western leader. In the conversation, Raisi blasting the U.S. for pulling out of the JCPOA and reimposing sanctions in the first place, adding that in any negotiation, quote, the rights of the Iranian nation must be secured and guaranteed, end quote. So with Iran's growing aggressions and hardball, if not stalling, negotiation tactics, CIA Director Burns coordinating with Israeli officials not just on security and a return to the JCPOA if possible, but on alternatives to the JCPOA entirely. Among them, the United States mulling easing sanctions on Tehran in exchange for a freeze on the more provocative parts of their nuclear program. Again, though, if Iran's nuclear development is as advanced as many experts think, no diplomatic solution will likely foil it at this point. In other news, for decades, the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel has had an exemption from military and most national service in favor of religious studies. The exemption sparking an ongoing and highly contentious debate, though. Yet, despite a bill on the exemptions being set to come up for discussion this week, the cabinet postponed the meeting over reported disagreements. And joining me now with more is former Yesh Atid Party Knesset member Rabbi Dov Lipman. Rabbi, thanks so much for being with us again. Firstly, the bill itself, what will it reportedly include, and how might it affect the Haredi community?
There's so much misinformation about what's actually included in this bill. It's a bill that was actually drafted by the Defense Department based on what their needs are in the military and what they think is realistic for the Haredi community. So the truth is, it will not expand the numbers of soldiers that are serving by a significant number. It'll be a little bit larger possibly than we have right now, but there's an emphasis on the point that it's young men who are not truly studying Torah, the religious studies, day and night, as they're supposed to be doing if they're getting the exemption. And it lays out options for national service, for other kinds of options as well, and also, very importantly, has impact on employment, allowing them to go to work at an earlier stage. So it's not some kind of revolutionary law which is going to go into the yeshivot, to religious seminaries, and bring the young men out and go to the army.
So why do you think the meeting was delayed? Why was it pushed off in the first place? Where's the disagreement here?
If you look even within the current coalition, where you have some who might want to see the legislation going even further, they do want to see perhaps more of an equality when it comes to the national service. I wouldn't be surprised if the Arab members of the coalition have some issues. The Arab parties have traditionally been very against any legislation that goes and impacts someone who has a religious ideology, because they also don't serve in the military, and perhaps they feel that it will infringe on that right. So there are many different areas within the coalition itself which could be fault points. And then they also do want to be very careful. Remember, you have a coalition of 61, and there's a very vocal opposition, and they're concerned possibly about the timing and how the vocal opposition will perhaps rally many in Israel against what they might see as religious coercion or overstepping their bounds. So I think they want to step very, very delicately here and make sure that the timing is right, and also that they have the entire coalition, all 61, on board for every single detail of that legislation.
All right, so let's talk now for a moment about national service as an alternative to military conscription. I know that you're a fan of promoting that, especially amongst the Haredi sector. Is that something that they would be behind, that the Haredi sector at large would be behind? Is that something that the Arab sector might actually come around for? And where does that fall in with this bill or with others on the table?
When we worked on this similar legislation in 2014, when I was a member of Knesset, I learned very quickly that there's a difference between what the Haredi politicians will say to the world vocally and what they'll say in closed doors in our meetings. They do understand that there has to be some kind of a change. They don't want this issue on the table all along, and they do recognize that there are young men who should leave the rabbinic seminaries and go do some kind of service. So we worked very hard, first of all, on having units in the army that were dedicated to the ultra-Orthodox, but there are still many who are against serving. So yes, I do believe that the more we open up national service options, whether it's in Magen David Adom, in serving in the ambulance corps, whether it's all kinds of other areas where they are already in the ultra-Orthodox community serving in very high numbers and volunteering, let's transform that into an actual national service. And I do believe that certainly quietly the ultra-Orthodox leadership will very much embrace that, and there's no doubt that in the Arab sector they will as well. That will definitely play a major role in solving this problem overall.
Do you think that a mandatory national service for all across sectors and demographics would create a stronger sense of patriotism and unity in the country, or might it actually backfire in some areas?
Well, I do want to be very clear. There is a role of service of the elite scholars who are truly studying day and night. And by the way, in meetings with Yair Lapid, the current foreign minister, the head of Yesh Atid, he has said as well, we have, as a country, there is a value, a Jewish state, in young men who are studying the religious texts day and night. It's a value and a service. And we should call that a service. But yes, saying all have to serve is very important for a country. And saying those who serve by studying Torah day and night, that's one form of service. There's national service, there's community service, there's army service. But the value, I've met with members of parliament from around the world who are jealous of Israel's overall ethos, that service is a part of our culture. So let's make that real, and let's make sure that everyone, and whatever they're doing, that is called service to the country, and bring us together around that ideal.
All right, Rabbi Dov Lipman, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Now on to COVID. The exponential graph is back. Daily coronavirus infections today roughly double the numbers from last week, and there's seemingly no signs of slowing. ILTV's Chana Rifkin joins with the report.
For the first time in 6 months, well over 6,000 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed in Israel overnight. The contagion rate likewise rising now to 4.8%, nearly 400 patients in serious condition. And the shocking numbers don't stop there. Health authorities finding that between 18 and 24% of ultra-Orthodox kids have had COVID-19. The results discovered during recent serological testing in the Haredi sector. In hopes of reopening classrooms across the country for in-person learning by September, the COVID cabinet launching its pilot of serological testing for students and beginning in ultra-Orthodox areas, where the school year began early this week. The idea being that students who test positive for COVID antibodies will receive a green pass and subsequent exemption from isolation should a classmate test positive for the virus later in the year. And the pilot set to extend next to the Arab sector, which also starts school before the general public in September, the general public being last to enter the program. Then, meantime, while pressing the young to go get vaccinated, Prime Minister Bennett repeating calls for the old to go get boosters. And nearly 600,000 have so far gotten their third shot of the vaccine, fewer than 50 of whom reported any side effects. Bennett reiterating that the treatment is safe and that if Israelis act fast, we can avoid another lockdown over the coming holiday season.
מגפת הדלתא משתוללת ברחבי העולם. בארצות הברית למשל יש עלייה של 1,000% בחודש האחרון. לכן אנחנו קיבלנו החלטה שאזרחי ישראל יהיו הראשונים בעולם לקבל את החיסון השלישי המשלים. כל ישראל ערבים זה לזה, זו המשמעות של ערבות הדדית, לא רק להיות אנוכי ולחמוק מזה, ללכת ולעשות את זה. אם נתחסן באלול, נוכל בעזרת השם לשמוע שופר ביחד בתשרי.
Still, despite the majority of the country maintaining their vaccinations, plus nearly a quarter of students having naturally produced antibodies, studies showing that inoculation waning in just about 4 months' time. So in light of this and the stubbornly rising infections, many warning that the government must choose between mandating vaccinations across all sectors or officially calling for a lockdown.
Moving on, a new Israeli environmental report showing that the Israeli coastlines are cleaner than they were last year, despite a massive oil spill in the Mediterranean. But while this is cause for celebration, another report from the UN is deflating that balloon. According to the recent Code Red report, climate change is getting worse and in a far shorter time span than anticipated. Here to discuss is head of the Department of Environmental Studies at Tel Aviv University, Professor Colin Price. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. What can you tell us about the UN's Code Red report findings in general?
So the UN comes out with these reports, the IPCC report, every 7 to 8 years. Now it's 8 years because it's delayed by COVID, and basically collects all the publications of the best scientists around the world. I think there were more than 2,000 papers included in this report, and hundreds of scientists working on this, and basically bringing us the state of the art of what we know about the climate today, what we know about the past climate, going back even hundreds of thousands of years, and what are the predictions for the coming future. And this report is the most severe that we've had. We've had these every 7 years from the 1990s onwards. This is the 6th report. And each report, the data gets better, the models get better, and our uncertainty gets smaller. And so we're much more certain now that the climate is changing. Things are changing faster than we expected, actually. And we also know that we're the cause. We're the problem, which are causing the climate to change. And if we don't do anything drastically, it's going to keep on changing, getting warmer, more extreme weather events, rising sea level in the near future, in the next decades.
All right, now, Israel was accused of a subpar response with respect to cooperating after the 2015 Paris Climate Accords with respect to reducing global emissions. What's happened since then?
Well, so recently we had to make adjustments to these commitments for the next big climate conference, which is going to be in Glasgow in November this year, the COP26. Unfortunately, Israel has claimed that they will reduce or move to 27% of renewable energies by 2030, when other countries have gone up to 50% renewables by that period. And by 2050, many countries are now claiming they'll go to net zero carbon emissions, which means whatever we put into the atmosphere, we can also take out through growing trees or other mechanisms. Israel claims they'll get to maybe 85% by 2050. So I think we're not as far as we should be. There's plenty more we can do in Israel. We have lots of sun in Israel, more sun than the Europeans have, and therefore we could really go much further and get to 50%, I think, renewables by 2030.
All right, so coming off of your response here about Israel needing to do a little bit more, saying that we can do those things, but we need to maybe pledge and really work towards getting there. That said, in response to this latest report, Israel's foreign ministry is saying that they believe Israel can lead the way for others with climate diplomacy. Specifically, the foreign ministry is saying, quote, Israeli experience and knowledge can help countries around the world in the fields of water tech, seawater desalination, drought-resistant agriculture and climate change, renewable energies and energy storage, development of animal protein substitutes, reforestation, and other areas that will help us face these challenges. How do you respond to that? Do you see Israel truly as this, global leader in climate change fighting?
I hope that we could lead the way. If we look at things like water technologies, drip irrigation, desalination, Israel's the leader, and we sell these technologies to the rest of the world. When we look at cybersecurity today, Israel's a leader, and therefore, as the startup nation, there's no reason that we cannot also lead the world with new technologies on renewable energies, on electric cars, new, more efficient agriculture. So I think we can be there, but obviously someone's got to invest in this. Hopefully the Israeli government will invest in it, like they've been investing in things related to, say, smart mobility. And with the startup nation mentality and ecosystem in Israel, I definitely think that this could be a win-win situation for Israel, that even though if we do everything correctly with our own environment, we're still going to have to face the consequences of climate change because this is a global phenomenon. But on the other hand, with our economy and our startup know-how, we can actually be part of the solution and sell many of those technologies to the rest of the world. And actually, it could be good for the Israeli economy.
All right, Professor Price, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing some of your insights about this growing problem.
You're welcome.
Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Temperatures mostly staying the same tonight. Tonight's lows ranging between 19 to 27 degrees Celsius, and then tomorrow, highs expecting to range from 31 to 36 degrees Celsius in most areas. Then, of course, temperatures a bit higher in Eilat at 40 degrees. And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral here in Israel. Yep. I feel like this is going to go bad. I already see one pita or bread. Looks like it's stuck up there. So close. He saved it just by a minute. All right. That is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.22 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well. Thank you so much for watching.